All Indiana Politics is your premier source for Indiana politics, focusing on issues that matter to you.
I still want us to be the best in the Midwest.
We can't afford another lockdown.
Give the citizens of this country the relief they need.
Education in the state of Indiana remains priority number one.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage.
We don't know exactly where the economy will be in January.
People are worried with good reason.
Exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders.
We have the resources here in the state of Indiana to care for those who are in need.
Expert analysis on critical legislation.
We need to reform those laws.
This recovery is going to take some time.
We've got to anticipate that there'll be a budget shortfall.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
I'm Garrett Bergquist, government reporter for Wish TV and the producer of All Indiana Politics. President Donald Trump's national security advisor and his Secretary of Defense both face calls to resign. The magazine The Atlantic revealed National Security Advisor Mike Waltz inadvertently added its editor-in-chief to a group chat on the Signal app concerning planned airstrikes in Yemen. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth posted specific information about the timing of those strikes in that chat. Signal is a free app that anyone can download. It's encrypted end-to-end, but it has multiple known vulnerabilities. Senator Todd Young serves on the Senate Intelligence Committee and received a classified briefing on the matter. I spoke with him shortly after the story broke. We also discussed the decision to award Boeing the contract for America's next jet fighter and an op-ed in which Young called for a national economic security strategy. Let's bring in Senator Todd Young. Senator, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Garrett.
So I want to begin with the incident in which Trump administration officials discussed the planned airstrikes in Yemen over Signal and apparently accidentally included the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic in the chat. You were in some of the hearings on this. Was this a security breach? Was classified information about the attacks leaked?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to ask about this in an open hearing and also a closed hearing of the Intel Committee. Clearly, I mean, common sense dictates this was not something that we should encourage. This is not something that should be done again. And we need to ensure that we have parameters in place to prevent it from happening in future cases. So that's my focus right now. I'm glad President Trump has emphasized the importance of this and that we won't be having this happen again. I do trust his national security team, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz in particular. He offers strong counsel to the president, and I think he's well served by his counsel to focus on terrorists, to make sure that terrorists know they can't lay in wait for American shipping, which we depend on to sustain our way of life. This is a marked change from the previous administration, frankly, where we allowed many of these terrorists to plan attacks and to conduct attacks against U.S. interests and those of our allies.
Still, this chat included some pretty specific information about the timing of the airstrikes. Should Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth or National Security Advisor Mike Waltz resign?
You know, that in the end is why the president was elected. He's going to make these decisions, and I support that sort of delegation of labor here. I do think that the National Security Advisor in particular, someone with whom I've served for a fairly long period, is well versed in these issues, and his counsel to the president to finally fight back to restore deterrence in the Middle East and beyond is very much appreciated, especially coming off the Biden administration where they did not take this sort of kinetic action when necessary.
Does this suggest a deeper problem with operational security, though, among the Trump administration's security team?
Well, it suggests that all of us in this age of cell phones and social media should be very careful. Should be very careful when we're not on secure lines, that is government lines and in secure facilities, ideally. And we should also only be communicating with people on a need-to-know basis. So we're going to learn from this example. I know the administration is, and there's still some unanswered questions, I do have to say, Garrett, and I was able to dive into much of that during the closed session, a couple of days ago.
You recently wrote an op-ed alongside former Marine Corps Commandant General David Berger, and you called for a national economic security strategy, and you followed that up with a similar op-ed this week. What prompted you to write them?
Well, I mean, China for really some period of time has been conducting economic warfare against the American people. They have been disrupting or threatening to disrupt our supply chains. It's a form of economic coercion. They've been dumping their commodities at below market, below production prices into the United States. They have been engaging in other forms of economic warfare. Intellectual property theft is a longstanding issue and needs to be addressed. And our playbook has been over the years incoherent. It's been a mix of sanctions policy and trade policy and working through the private sector and public sector on sort of a one-off basis. There are lessons to be learned from each of our different employments of economic tools of statecraft and the interplay between different economic tools. And we need to start formalizing those lessons learned in a broader strategy and figure out in different contexts how we can affect changes in behavior from our adversaries, China in particular. And so that's really what I'm asking for. I'm asking for the same sort of intentionality and rigor to be brought to economic warfare and countering economic warfare as is currently brought and has long been brought to our military power. And I think that needs to be committed to paper. And that's what the Commandant of the Marine Corps and I have been communicating about.
What role might Indiana be able to play in a national economic security strategy? For example, NSA, Crane, or some of the manufacturers in the northern part of the state?
Well, I think in recent years, I've tried to highlight the fact that Indiana, being the most manufacturing intensive state in the country, can play an essential role in hardening ourselves against economic warfare, particularly against disrupting our supply chains. But not just that. Innovation within the manufacturing sector and taking many of the things we invent here and turning them into real products through manufacturing is another talent we have. And so we can be less dependent on countries that we don't have a high level of trust with, China namely, but many other countries as well, if we're able to harden ourselves against stormy seas. And so my latest addition to this is an initiative that is sort of pursuant to a national economic security strategy. It's a shipbuilding initiative. I'll have more information for Hoosiers soon about that effort. President Trump mentioned the importance of this initiative in his State of the Union address, and it's one of many examples, and I hope opportunities for Hoosiers to make us safer and more secure while creating more jobs in the heartland.
In that speech to Congress, though, the president called for repealing the CHIPS and Science Act, which you worked very hard on. Have you had a chance to talk to him about his concerns?
I have. Yeah, I've spoken to the president. I've spoken to those around him. The president's made no bones about the fact that certain aspects of implementation of the CHIPS Act he didn't like. Heck, I had to work with the Biden administration on this implementation. So you can imagine there were certain things I wasn't happy with as well. A child care mandate made no sense in a tight labor market. These fabs where people are employed to make semiconductors are probably going to be offered high quality child care anyway to work there. Union labor to build these fabs. That was a principled compromise I made with the other co-sponsors of this legislation. It may cost a bit more, but it is of high quality. And I know the Trump administration has prided itself on its engagement of labor. So, I'll work with the president to make tweaks to this legislation. But I have to say, if you have received a private sector foreign direct investment commitment of roughly $500 billion and counting for an investment of $30 billion, that's an amazing return on taxpayer investment. More importantly, we're going to be a lot more prepared for a doomsday scenario in which the very computer chips that go into our ballistic missiles and our warfighters' equipment, we're more independent of other countries in sourcing those semiconductors. So great piece of legislation, and we'll work with President Trump to improve it.
Speaking of defense manufacturing, President Trump announced that Boeing will build the F-47 fighter. Was that a wise choice given some of the recent struggles Boeing has had?
You know, reputationally, there's no question Boeing has taken a big hit. I've asked some probing questions in recent years of their leadership. I was just on the phone this week with their CEO, sort of peppering him with questions about internal improvements. The Armed Services Committee here in the U.S. Senate and DOD is really going to have to continue to kick the tires and make sure that Boeing is up to the task with respect to this. I'll certainly do my part as well.
How do we ensure this doesn't turn into a repeat of the F-35? That was billed as a cost-saving program, and it turned into the most expensive weapons program in U.S. history.
That's why we have an independent branch of government, as frustrating as it might be to some folks sometimes. And we have an independent voice, and we need to provide rigor and scrutiny to their production process. We need to ask hard questions, and you know, it's incumbent upon the DOD to do this as well. And so I'll probably have more to say about this contract and this relationship on a going forward basis.
More broadly, does the Pentagon need to rethink any of its additional current ongoing weapons programs? As we've had a number of programs, not just the F-35, that ended up years behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget.
Well, listen, I've been quite clear to my colleagues on the Armed Services Committee and to many of the people within the Pentagon and this administration. We need to stop buying the platforms of yesteryear. We need to learn the lessons of current wars, like the war in Ukraine, like the war in Gaza, where for a very modest amount of investment, we see warfighters in other countries that are able to take commercial off-the-shelf, very cheap solutions, modify them, and turn them into lethal weapons. Why can't we do that? Well, we should do that. Let's put our best innovators on the beat. Let's stop buying oftentimes very beautiful platforms where they're not needed. And let's spend the taxpayers' money like it's our own. I actually think that will lead to more lethal force, more effectiveness, and probably could be accomplished in a lot more fiscally responsible way. I think this is one of the reasons, frankly, why President Trump was elected, so he could bring this culture of value-added, more business-oriented culture into the Pentagon.
Senator Todd Young, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That was Senator Todd Young of Indiana. Remember, you can catch All Indiana Politics every Sunday morning at 9:30, only on Wish TV. I'm Garrett Bergquist. Thanks for listening.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.